You think you're better than all of us, huh? Blake growled, his eyes narrowing to slits and his hands clenching into fists. The air around him seemed to freeze as the entire schoolyard froze in anticipation. Emily looked up, her brown eyes showing no fear or anger, just the calm confidence of someone who knew more. "No, Blake," she said quietly. "I just know who I am." Blake's laughter echoed throughout the yard. "And who are you?" At that moment, the roar of an engine was heard. A black Dodge Challenger with tinted windows stopped at the curb. The windows slowly rolled down. "Still think you know who you're dealing with?" Emily asked, smiling for the first time since their confrontation began. Blake went pale, his confidence gone in an instant. Vin Diesel was behind the wheel. "The most interesting part is coming. Stay with us to find out how it all ends. In the meantime, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't lose it." Emily Walker stood in front of the massive Mountain Creek High School in San Diego, California, clutching the straps of her backpack until her knuckles turned white. She nervously fingered the multicolored bracelets on her left wrist, an old habit she had never been able to break. The sun beat down relentlessly, making the asphalt almost melt under her feet, and the sea breeze that usually brought a cool breeze seemed like a distant memory today. The schoolyard was buzzing with the voices of students gathered in groups around long stone benches and under spreading palm trees, some laughing loudly, waving their arms as they talked about their summer adventures, others exchanging the latest gossip, holding their smartphones to their chests as if protecting their deepest secrets. Fashionable sunglasses, brand-name t-shirts, and that laid-back Californian vibe that had always seemed so foreign and unattainable to Emily. And she stood alone, feeling invisible in the crowd. Despite her slightly distinctive appearance, worn jeans with holes in the knees, not from a designer, but from real wear, a simple black t-shirt, old but clean sneakers, and a backpack that had seen more than one school. A backpack that became a symbol of her nomadic school life. 5th school in 4 years, Emily calculated silently, running a hand through her hair, tucking a stray strand behind her ear. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with hot air that smelled of asphalt and a mixture of dozens of different perfumes. New city, new school, new people who will look at me like I'm an outsider. The thought made her smile bitterly. Some kids move because their parents moved jobs. Emily moved because she needed a fresh start. Over and over again, memories of her previous schools flashed through her mind in quick succession. Portland, where she'd been ignored. Phoenix, where rumors had spread about her family. Denver, where a group of girls had made her the butt of their cruel jokes. And everywhere there'd been someone who felt it was their duty to put the new girl in her place. Her father always said, "We don't run from our problems, we just choose our battles." And Emily agreed. But sometimes she wanted to ask, why does every new school have to be a battlefield? She took one last deep breath, squared her shoulders, and moved toward the main entrance, keeping her head down and trying not to attract attention. Her long brown hair, pulled back into a loose ponytail, swayed slightly with each step. Several students turned to look curiously at the new girl with her unusual appearance. Tall, slender, with distinct cheekbones that gave her face an almost aristocratic expression. Years of kickboxing with her father had given her movements a grace and confidence that belied her desire to remain unnoticed. "Look, new girl," one girl whispered to another, but Emily caught the whisper. She had learned to listen, learned to notice. At her new school, it was a necessary survival skill. Emily avoided their gaze as if she physically felt the weight of someone else's attention. Every glance thrown in her direction seemed weighty, tangible. She developed a special defense mechanism, a complete lack of reaction, as if she were under an invisible shield that did not let through either curiosity or ridicule. Mountain Creek High loomed before her, an imposing 3-story building of beige brick with large windows and wide front doors. The American flag fluttered lazily from the flagpole, and a sign bearing the school name and the motto, "Reach for the top," glittered in the sun. The school was a typical California high school, filled with mostly middle-class kids who had known each other since kindergarten. The football team was a respectable one. Judging by the many pennants and banners hung around the grounds, the cheerleading squad was popular, and the social hierarchy had been established long before Emily arrived. Not that she cared. She had only one goal: to remain unnoticed, to get through the school year as quietly and peacefully as possible. No drama, no problems. This time it's going to be different, she promised herself as she stepped through the school doors. I'll just sit quietly, do my job, and not attract attention. She'd had the same plan at her previous 4 schools, but something always went wrong. There was always someone who couldn't leave her alone. Inside, the school hallways were buzzing with energy. Metal locker doors slammed, sneakers squeaked on tile floors, giggles and exclamations echoed, and teachers, folders, and coffee cups in hand, tried to herd students into their classrooms before the first bell. The smell of new textbooks mingled with the aroma of coffee from the staff room and something vaguely school-like, a mixture of disinfectant, gymnasium, and 100 teenage hopes and fears. Emily walked, clutching the schedule the administrative office had given her. It was already slightly wrinkled from her nervous rereading. She was familiar with the routine, finding her locker, figuring out where she would sit in the cafeteria, and, most importantly, identifying the kids she should stay away from. Over the years of moving, she had become an expert at quickly mapping out a new school's social landscape. The first thing she always did was look for her locker. Room 423, 3rd floor, West Wing. She had the building's floor plan memorized by now, a habit developed over years of moving from school to school. Knowing the locations of all the exits, offices, hiding spots where she could take cover if necessary. Her father, a gunman and stuntman, had always taught her, know your territory better than your enemy. Emily walked up the main stairs, following the signs and carefully observing the group dynamics around her. Jocks in school-issued jackets were gathered near the trophy cabinets, loudly discussing the upcoming season. A group of girls who looked like cheerleaders, perfect makeup, hair pulled back into high ponytails, short skirts and school logo tops, occupied a bench by the window, whispering and giggling. In the corner, nerdy kids with thick glasses were hunched over tablets, discussing something in terms that would sound like a foreign language to most teenagers. Emily mentally recorded it all, creating a map of social groups and their territories. It was a skill her father had taught her, to observe, to analyze, to prepare. Information is power, he often said. Observe everything without being noticed. That way, you'll always be one step ahead. As she reached the 3rd floor and turned toward the West Wing, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. That's when she saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with the self-assured demeanor of the most untouchable and popular kids in high school. He stood in the center of the hallway, leaning against a row of lockers like they were his personal property, surrounded by a group of guys in Mountain Creek sports jackets. His dark blonde hair was styled in a messy but obviously carefully planned hairstyle. An expensive watch gleamed on his wrist, and his white smile flashed as he said something that made everyone around him burst into laughter. Blake Carter, Emily noted, remembering the name she'd heard briefly in the office while the secretary was on the phone. Football quarterback, student council president, son of one of San Diego's richest real estate developers. A man who apparently thought he owned the school. Even from a distance, Emily could see that he exuded an aura of control. That special kind of power that made people either follow him or fear him. She knew people like Blake, golden boy, football star, good looks, rich family. But there was something else too. The way the students around him laughed too loudly, the way they shifted nervously from one foot to the other when he spoke, the way they sought approval in his eyes. Classic alpha predator, Emily thought, slowing her pace. Her instincts, honed by years of moving and changing schools, screamed danger. Stay away. Don't be seen. Don't become a target. Emily recognized the pattern. She'd met kids like Blake before, the ones who thrived on power and intimidation, the ones who only felt important when they were putting others down. In Portland, it was the captain of the basketball team. In Phoenix, the principal's son. In Denver, the girl from a powerful local family. Different faces, but the same type. She hadn't planned on attracting his attention. The plan was simple. Get around this group, find her locker, and disappear from their radar. But fate decreed otherwise. As she passed, keeping close to the opposite wall of the hallway, one of Blake's group, a stocky guy with a short haircut and an angry expression, suddenly took a step to the side, bumping into her shoulder. It wasn't an accident. The move was too precisely calculated to look like an awkward accident. The impact was strong enough to knock Emily off balance. Her books and folders crashed to the floor, scattering across the hallway like autumn leaves in the wind. The schedule she had been clutching floated smoothly to Blake's feet. Several students turned to watch the performance, some giggling, some looking sympathetic, but no one rushed to help. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a flash of anger that she quickly suppressed. She quickly bent down, starting to gather her things, avoiding eye contact with Blake's group. Well, what do we have here? The voice above her made her freeze. Deep, slightly husky, with that special intonation of superiority that was impossible to confuse with anything else. Emily didn't have to look up to know whose voice it was. Blake Carter. His voice was calm, amused, but there was a sharpness to it, like a lion playing with its prey. She could hear his friends giggling behind him, anticipating the show. A new girl, a perfect target, a fresh distraction. Blake leaned over and picked up her schedule, studying it with exaggerated interest. Emily Walker, he read aloud, drawing out the syllables as if tasting the name. From Denver, by golly. You're a long way from home. Emily from Denver. Slowly she looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. Blake towered over her, 6 feet 2 inches of pure confidence. He was dressed in designer jeans and a polo shirt with a famous brand logo on it, expensive sunglasses hanging around his neck, and a watch that probably cost more than all her clothes combined glittered on his wrist. His face was too perfect. Evenly tanned, strong jawline. Blue eyes under dark brows. That same infuriating smirk she'd seen on bullies before. The kind who knew they ran the school. I haven't seen you before, he said, handing her the schedule. But when she reached for it, he raised his hand higher, forcing her to stand. Are you new? A small crowd began to gather around them, drawn by the prospect of the first drama of the new school year. Emily felt dozens of eyes boring into her, assessing, studying, passing silent judgment. A voice inside her screamed, "Don't react. Just take your things and go." Emily didn't answer. She simply gathered her books and stood up, holding out her hand for her schedule. Her face was a mask of calm, but inside she was seething with anger. She hated this, being the center of attention, being a target, an object of entertainment for the likes of Blake. 5 schools in 4 years and all the same. Blake seemed surprised by her silence. Usually the newbies didn't react that way. Some would stammer apologies, some would snap back, some would beg to be left alone. But this new girl just looked at him so calmly, like she didn't care, like he didn't matter. He slowly lowered his hand, handing her the schedule. But when she took it and tried to walk past him, he stepped aside, blocking her path. "Hey, how about a thank you?" he asked loudly so everyone could hear. "I helped you pick up your thing. Don't they teach you manners in Denver?" Emily looked him straight in the eye, and for a second Blake saw something there that made him flinch inside. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was knowing. Like she could see right through him, see through his game, all his tricks, like he was an open book to her. "Thank you," she said quietly but firmly, without a trace of fear or irritation, just a statement of fact. And with that, she simply walked around him and continued on her way to the locker, ignoring the whispers and giggles that were heard behind her. Blake stood there, slightly stunned. This wasn't what he'd expected. New girls weren't supposed to be so calm. They were supposed to be scared, unsure, easy targets. And this girl had just walked right past him like he was just another obstacle in her path. "Hey, where are your manners?" he called after her, his voice carrying down the hall. "I asked you a question. Is everyone this rude in Denver?" Emily kept walking, not looking back. Her back was straight, her shoulders back, her stride confident. She had played this game before. She knew the rules, she knew the strategies. The best way to deal with people like Blake was to not engage with them, to not give them fuel for their little power games. But Blake didn't like being ignored. He was a football star, the son of a powerful businessman, the king of this school. People didn't ignore Blake Carter. Ever. He caught up with her quickly, his friends following behind, anticipating what would happen next. That's when she felt it, a sharp tug on her backpack, pulling her back with enough force that she almost lost her balance. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to let her know that Blake wasn't going to let her go. The hallway suddenly became unnaturally quiet. Even the normal noises of school, talk, laughter, lockers slamming, seemed muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the school mixer. All eyes were on them. The new girl and the school king, frozen in a silent standoff in the middle of the hallway. Emily stopped. Slowly she turned, her movements calm, almost graceful, like a dancer or a skilled fighter. For a moment, the hallway seemed to fall into absolute silence. Even the students who hadn't paid attention before began to watch, sensing that something significant was happening. She met Blake's gaze and for the first time, Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps even a little surprise. Most people reacted to his provocations in the predictable way, with fear, anger, tears. But there was none of that in this girl's eyes. Just a calm, almost cold assessment, as if she were analyzing him like an interesting but unimportant specimen under a microscope. "You shouldn't have done that," Emily said quietly, her voice low and controlled, but with a steeliness to it that made several of the watching students glance at each other. Blake raised an eyebrow, then laughed, slowly, mockingly, but there was a note of uncertainty in his laughter that he tried hard to hide. "And why is that?" he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive gesture that betrayed his inner discomfort. "What are you going to do, new girl? Tell the principal? Cry?" Emily didn't answer. She just continued to stare at him, unblinking, her face calm, but her eyes. Her eyes seemed to see right through him, right through his entire facade, straight to the uncertainty and fear he hid so carefully behind his mask of self-confidence. Blake felt a chill run down his spine. This girl was different, not like any of the newbies he had dealt with before. There was something dangerous about her. He tilted his head, trying to hide his growing concern behind a smirk. "You're weird, you know that." A few chuckles from his friends, but they sounded strained, unsure. They sensed it too. Something was wrong with this new girl, something that was out of step with the normal order of things. Emily held his gaze for another second, then without a word turned and walked away. Her walk was steady, confident, her back straight. She wasn't running, she was just walking away, like someone who had better things to do than waste time on schoolyard bullies. Blake stood watching her go, feeling a strange combination of irritation and respect. No, it was something else. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was unpleasant, unsettling. He didn't like being ignored. He didn't like being unintimidated by anyone. And this new girl, Emily Walker from Denver, certainly wasn't afraid of him. This isn't over, he thought, watching her disappear around the corner of the hallway. No one ignores Blake Carter. No one. But an inner voice, the one that was usually silent, whispered, "Be careful. She's not your average new girl." Blake waved the voice away. Emily Walker was just another girl in a long line of newcomers who tried to act stronger than they were. By the end of the week, she would know her place. He would make sure of that. She didn't have to look back to know that Blake wasn't done with her yet. She'd seen his type dozens of times, and he had no idea what a mistake he was about to make. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily stayed at the back of the classroom, answering only when necessary, avoiding eye contact with other students. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers. "That's the new girl who bumped into Blake. They say she wasn't even scared. I wonder who she is." Word travels faster in high school than a forest fire in the dry season. By third period, everyone in the school knew about the new girl who dared to defy Blake Carter himself. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with respect, but most with pity. They all knew what happened to those who crossed Blake. She ate lunch alone, finding a spot at the far end of the dining room where she could observe the entire room without attracting attention. Years of moving had taught her to choose strategic positions, always with her back to the wall, always with a clear view, always with an escape route. The Mountain Creek High cafeteria was a classic scene from an American high school movie. Long tables, divided by social groups, as if by invisible boundaries. Jocks by the windows, nerds by the wall, cheerleaders in the middle, artists by the garden entrance. A picture of social hierarchy painted by trays of food and soda cans. But the center, the undisputed center of this social galaxy, was Blake Carter's desk. Blake and his friends owned the dining room like feudal lords owned their lands. They occupied the largest table in the center, talking loudly, laughing, as if they had not a care in the world, as if the school existed solely for their amusement. Every now and then Emily felt his eyes on her, quick, assessing, as if he were trying to figure out what to do with this strange new threat to his authority. She watched him from the corner of her eye, studying his habits, his social circle, his methods of maintaining control. Blake was the classic schoolyard bully, charismatic, physically powerful, socially influential. He used a combination of fear, admiration, and manipulation to keep others under control. And he did it masterfully. Emily saw him clap a younger student on the shoulder, loudly complimenting his shirt, causing the boy to beam with pride. A minute later, he would whisper something to his friends, causing them to laugh and look back at the same boy whose excitement had turned to embarrassment and shame. It was a game of carrot and stick, played with the precision of a surgeon. He was dangerous, Emily thought as she watched the spectacle. Not physically, though she had no doubt he could be that, but psychologically. He knew how to manipulate people, how to control a situation, how to keep everyone in fear and admiration at the same time. By the end of the day, Emily was relieved to finally leave school. The California heat was still intense, causing the asphalt to shimmer as she walked to the bus stop a block away. Her head was full of new names, faces, classes, and of course, Blake Carter. She analyzed the encounter that morning, replaying it over and over like a movie, trying to figure out if she could have avoided the confrontation, if she could have gone unnoticed. No, she decided. Blake was the type who was always looking for a new victim, a new distraction. If not today, then tomorrow or the day after. It was inevitable. The question was, what to do now? Her father always said, when conflict is inevitable, choose the time and place yourself. Emily knew Blake wouldn't leave her alone. She had broken his rules. She had shown no fear. In his world, that was unforgivable. Just as she was reaching for her phone to check the time of the next bus, a voice came from behind her. "Hey, new girl!" She felt a shiver run down her spine, but her face remained serene. Slowly, she turned around. Blake stood there 10 feet away, his hands in the pockets of his designer jeans, his sunglasses pulled down over his eyes against the relentless California sun. The smirk still plastered to his face, but there was something harder, more purposeful about it now. Behind him, a few of his friends shifted from foot to foot, waiting, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Emily quickly assessed the situation. The bus stop was empty. The street was relatively quiet at this time of day. Most of the students had already gone home or stayed for after-school activities. There was no help in sight. She was alone against Blake and his entourage. But Emily didn't feel fear. She felt readiness. "What do you want?" she asked calmly, her voice firm, without a hint of worry. Blake took a slow step forward, his movements relaxed, almost lazy. But Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, could see his friends tensing up, ready for action. "You have an attitude problem, you know that?" His voice was quiet, almost friendly, but with that special edge of menace that Emily had heard so many times from his kind. She didn't answer, just continued to look at him, her face a mask of calm, but her eyes were attentive, assessing. She noted the distance between them, the position of his friends, possible escape routes. Years of training with his father had not been in vain. Blake's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. They held the cold calculation of a predator assessing its prey. "What, you think you're better than me?" His voice rose, genuine irritation in it. "You think you can come to my school and ignore me?" Emily gave a short laugh, not nervous, not scared, just amused. And that, more than anything else, caught Blake off guard. People didn't laugh at him, ever. "I think," she said slowly, weighing each word, "that you should leave." Blake's grin faltered for half a second before he collected himself, something in his eyes that might have been taken for uncertainty if this wasn't Blake Carter, who never doubted. "What are you saying?" He took another step closer, now close enough for her to smell his expensive cologne. He towered over her, using his height to his advantage, looming over her, trying to intimidate her with his mere presence. "And why is that?" Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was such confidence in it, such strength, that even Blake's friends couldn't help but lean forward, trying to hear. "Because you have no idea who I am." Blake chuckled, shaking his head, but there was no real humor in his laughter, only tension and growing irritation. "Who are you?" he asked defiantly, but something inside him trembled. Something about this girl was wrong. She wasn't afraid. She should have been. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, her movements smooth, controlled. She picked up her phone, still in her hand, and pressed a single button on the screen, never taking her eyes off Blake. There was a moment of silence, and then a loud, rumbling roar of an engine broke the silence of the street. The sound was deep, powerful, unlike the regular cars that drove through the neighborhood. It was the sound of pure, unbridled power. A black Dodge Challenger with tinted windows slowly came around the corner and pulled up to the curb, stopping directly in front of Emily. It was a gorgeous car, shiny black, chrome trim, wide tires that seemed to barely touch the asphalt. The kind of car that made heads turn. The kind of car that said, "I'm not just transportation, I'm a statement." The tinted windows slowly rolled down, and Blake felt his heart do a somersault in his chest, and then almost stop when he saw the driver. It was him, Vin Diesel. Not just a look-alike, not just a fan with the same bald head and muscular arms. It was the real Vin Diesel, the fast and the furious star, the Hollywood legend, sitting behind the wheel of a Dodge Challenger, as if it were any other day. Not the moment that changed Blake Carter's entire world. Blake's smirk vanished as if washed away by a tidal wave. His confidence evaporated, leaving behind only the shocked expression of a boy who suddenly realized he was out of his league. Emily turned back to Blake, smiling for the first time all day. It wasn't a smirk, not a superior smirk, just the calm, confident smile of someone in control. "Do you still think I'm weird?" she asked, and there was no mockery in her voice, only a slight curiosity, as if she was genuinely interested in his answer. Blake didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. He was the one who felt small, who felt insignificant, for the first time in his life. His friends froze, their eyes wide in shock, some already taking out their phones, not believing their eyes, wanting to capture the moment when Vin Diesel himself appeared in their small school world. Emily watched as Blake's cocky grin faded, his jaw tightened. His eyes darted between her and the unmistakable figure behind the wheel of a Dodge Challenger. The air was thick, electric with anticipation. The playful confidence in his posture was now replaced by tension, uncertainty. He took a half step back, his friends exchanging nervous glances behind him, none of them daring to speak. Emily, on the other hand, was in no hurry. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, exhaling slowly, as if she hadn't just turned the tables on the school's self-proclaimed king. Her internal chronometer was ticking away the seconds, and she was savoring every one of them, drinking in the look of absolute shock on Blake's face. Vin Diesel didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, one hand on the wheel, a muscular, tattooed arm that was unmistakable, his gaze fixed on Blake. It was a gaze that carried weight, the kind of presence that didn't need words to convey its message. The gaze of a man who didn't play tough guys in movies. He was a tough guy. Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as if he were trying to push down a lump in his throat. "Wait a minute," he muttered under his breath, almost as if he was trying to convince himself that this wasn't real, that this was some weird dream or hallucination. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, suddenly took on a note of uncertainty, almost childish confusion. He looked at Emily again, this time really looking at her as if trying to piece together a puzzle that should have been obvious all along. The strange new girl who wasn't afraid, who carried herself with such confidence, who looked at him like she could see right through him. And now, Vin Diesel. Emily leaned in slightly, just enough for Blake to hear her, though she tried to keep her voice even and low. "Still think I'm just some random girl?" she asked. And there was no malice in her question, just a calm statement of fact. Blake's Adam's apple twitched as he swallowed again, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something, but had lost all ability to form words. The school's king, the football star, the guy who had terrorized every student at Mountain Creek, was suddenly a silent statue frozen in shock. Then Vin spoke, and his voice was exactly the same as it had become to millions of fans around the world. Deep, husky, full of hidden power. "Get in, baby," he said to Emily, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a command that couldn't be disobeyed. Emily didn't hesitate. There was the same grace and confidence in her movements that Blake had noticed that morning. She walked past Blake's frozen form, past his dumbfounded friends, past the deafening silence of the crowd that was beginning to form. Other students who had noticed the unusual car began to gather, their eyes widening as they recognized the famous driver. Emily opened the passenger door and slid in with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The Challenger's interior was as impressive as its exterior. Black leather, chrome accents, the smell of new car and expensive cologne. The moment she got in, Vin shifted into gear, and the Challenger let out a deep, almost animalistic growl as it pulled away from the curb. The last thing Emily saw was Blake Carter, still standing there, his face frozen in an expression of absolute shock, a crowd of students already gathering around him, each with a phone in hand. each asking the same question. What just happened? For a moment, the car was silent. The city of San Diego blurred outside the windows, a blur of colors and shapes, the late afternoon sun casting long streaks of orange and gold across the dashboard, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Emily let her fingers drum lightly on her knee as she exhaled, finally releasing the tension that had been building since she first set foot on campus. Her shoulders relaxed and she leaned back against the soft leather seat, enjoying the moment of silence and safety. Vin kept his eyes on the road, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the steering wheel in time, with the music playing softly from the speakers. Something classical, perhaps Beethoven or Mozart, which always surprised those who expected something more aggressive from a man like Vin. "Are you okay, daughter?" he asked finally, glancing at her quickly. There was concern in his eyes, but also something like pride. Emily nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "Yes, Dad," she replied, and then, after a pause, let out a soft laugh that seemed to release any remaining tension. "That was a little dramatic, wasn't it?" Vin chuckled, his trademark half-smile creeping onto his face. The same smile that made the hearts of fans around the world beat faster. "A little," he agreed, turning onto the wide avenue leading out of the school district. "But effective." She shook her head, letting her gaze drift out the window, watching the suburbs of San Diego give way to more upscale neighborhoods where the houses got bigger, the yards more manicured, the cars more expensive. "I didn't want them to find out like this," she said, her voice a little quieter. "I was hoping, I don't know, maybe this time it would be different." Vin looked at her with understanding. He knew what his daughter went through every time they moved, every time she started at a new school. He knew about her desire to just be a normal teenager, not Vin Diesel's daughter. "Well, what would be the best way?" he asked, his voice soft but with steel in it. "Let some punk like him walk all over you? Bully you?" Emily sighed, leaning her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. "I wasn't going to let him walk all over me, Dad," she said with a confidence that reminded Vin of his younger self. "I was just waiting." Vin raised an eyebrow, giving her an interested look. "What?" She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "The right moment. I wanted to understand how this school worked, who was who before making a move." But he sped things up. Vin was silent for a moment, considering her words before chuckling softly. "You're like me when I was your age," he said with a note of pride in his voice. Always thinking a few steps ahead, Emily turned to him, the corner of her lips curling into a smirk. "That's a scary thought," she teased. "You were quite the tomboy, if Uncle Paul's stories are to be believed." Vin laughed out loud, shaking his head. Paul Walker, his best friend and soul brother, always loved to tell Emily stories about young Vin, most of them greatly embellished. "Clever girl," he said with genuine admiration. "You have a sharp tongue, like your mother." The mention of Emily's mother brought a fleeting shadow to her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. It was an old hurt that had never fully gone away, but had become more manageable over the years. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the tension from the earlier incident slowly melting away as the familiarity of their conversation settled in. Music played softly in the background, the sun slowly setting, painting everything in warm tones, creating an almost idyllic scene. But somewhere in the back of Emily's mind, she knew this was just the beginning. Blake Carter had been publicly humiliated, his status as school king in jeopardy, his confidence shattered. Boys like him didn't forgive that. She knew that just because the moment had passed, the problem didn't go away. Blake Carter wasn't the type to let things go, and even if he were, fear had a funny way of turning into anger and hurt pride into revenge. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, a modern two-story mansion with large windows and minimalist design, tucked away in a quiet San Diego suburb where the rich but not flashy live, Emily unbuckled her seatbelt but was in no hurry to get out. Vin noticed her thoughtfulness, turning off the engine but not moving, giving her time to gather her thoughts. "Something else on your mind?" he asked, knowing his daughter well enough to know when she was deep in strategic planning. Emily paused, looking at her hands, then exhaled, finally voicing what they both knew. "He's not done with me." Vin studied her for a long moment, his gaze both soft and hard. He wasn't just her father. He was her protector, her teacher, the man who taught her to be strong in a world that often wasn't kind to those who were different. "Yes," he said finally, his voice confident, knowing, "but you're not finished with him either." Emily met his gaze, a determination in her eyes that always reminded Vin of himself, of the strength he'd seen in the mirror when he was young and struggling with his own demons. "Do you think I should fight back?" she asked, though it wasn't so much a question as a request for confirmation of a strategy she'd already thought through. Vin leaned back in his seat, his hand on the wheel, his expression serious, focused. "I think you need to be prepared, because guys like him don't like to lose," he said, and his voice held the wisdom of a man who'd seen his share of conflict. "They take any challenge as a personal affront, and they won't rest until they feel they've restored their status." Emily pressed her lips together in thought, her eyes narrowing slightly, as they always did when she was deep in thought. She ran through her options, running through scenarios, weighing the risks. Finally, she nodded, making her decision. "Yes, I know, and I'll be ready." Vin smiled, his eyes a mixture of pride and concern, like any parent who wants to protect their child, but knows they must let them fight their own battles. "I know you will," he said with confidence. "You're always ready." They got out of the car and headed toward the house, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow would bring. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But Emily knew the real storm was yet to come. At night, lying in her new room with a ceiling that she hadn't yet had time to glue glow-in-the-dark stars to, Emily thought about the strategy. Her thoughts were clear, orderly, methodical. She had always been like that, an analyst, a strategist, someone who looked at the board as a whole, not just the next move. She knew Blake would retaliate in some form. The only question was what form it would take. Physical confrontation? Unlikely. Despite his athletic build and obvious strength, Blake was too smart to risk his future by fighting, especially with a girl. Subtle bullying? Possibly. Social isolation? Almost certainly. Emily rolled over, looking at the photograph on her nightstand. Her and her father on the set of the latest Fast and Furious movie. Both in leather jackets, both wearing the same half-smiles that so often irritated directors. The photograph reminded her of who she was. The daughter of a man who never backed down, never gave in, always found a way, even when things seemed hopeless. "I'm ready for you, Blake Carter," she thought, closing her eyes. "The question is, are you ready for me?" When Emily walked into the halls of Mountain Creek High the next morning, she immediately sensed a change in atmosphere. Whispers accompanied her every step, as if she were walking through a sound field of hushed voices and curious glances. Some students looked with outright curiosity, others with new respect, and still others with downright envy. The news that the new girl was somehow connected to Vin Diesel spread with a speed that would make even the fastest internet gossip blush. By the time Emily got to her locker, she had heard at least 10 different versions of what had happened the night before, each more dramatic than the last. "And she just got into his car like it was the most normal thing," one girl whispered to her friend, casting admiring glances at Emily. "They say she's his daughter." "I heard she's his niece," the other retorted, shaking her head slightly. "My cousin knows someone who works in Hollywood and says Vin Diesel doesn't have a daughter that age." "Maybe she's his goddaughter?" suggested a guy with thick glasses sitting next to them. "Or maybe he's just a family friend." Emily smiled to herself as she listened to these theories. They weren't new. Every new school, every new town, there were always the same assumptions, the same rumors. People never believed that she really was Vin Diesel's daughter until they saw the evidence with their own eyes, which was probably fair. It wasn't every day you met the child of a Hollywood star in a regular public school. But the fact remained. Emily was Vin Diesel's daughter, although she bore her mother's last name, Walker, in honor of her father's best friend, and her godfather, Paul Walker, who had died tragically a few years before she was born. It was a decision made for her protection, to give her at least some chance at a normal life away from the constant attention of the paparazzi. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes, like now, the plan went awry. She saw Blake standing by the lockers, surrounded by his usual minions. But something about his posture was different. He no longer seemed so confident, so dominant. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and his gaze was more cautious, assessing. He scanned the hallway like a predator who had suddenly discovered that he was no longer the only predator on the food chain. When their eyes met, she saw a mixture of anger and confusion in his eyes. Anger because she had dared to challenge his authority. Confusion because he didn't know how to handle it. Blake wasn't used to being on the losing side, and Emily could see how hard he was trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. She walked past him, purposefully not even bothering to look at him, as if he were nothing more than a stain on the hallway wall. It was a calculated move. Nothing irritates a narcissistic personality more than being ignored. And Blake, with all the hallmarks of a school narcissist, was probably seething with indignation right now. Emily heard one of his friends mutter, "Hey, Blake, is she really Vin Diesel's daughter?" "Shut up, Jason," Blake snapped. But there was a nervousness in his voice that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man whose feet were suddenly on the rocks, and he was trying to keep his balance. Jason, a stocky guy with a crew cut and a permanently red face, like he was always on the verge of a fit of anger, frowned. "I was just asking, man, if she really is Diesel's daughter, maybe we should—" "Worth what?" Blake interrupted, his voice quieter but harsher. "Afraid of her? Is that what you're saying? That we should be afraid of some new girl just because her dad is famous?" Jason raised his hands defensively. "That's not what I meant. It's just—" "Just what?" Blake stepped closer, his face twisted in poorly concealed anger. "Nothing has changed, okay? Nothing. This school is still ours, and some new girl with a famous dad isn't going to change that." But even as he said these words, Emily saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He was trying to convince himself, not so much of Jason. By lunchtime, the tension in the school was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emily felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on her as she walked down the hall, noting the shift in the social dynamics. Some students who would never have thought to talk to her before were now smiling and waving. Others, mostly from Blake's circle, were openly hostile. But what struck Emily most was the number of students who seemed to look at her with hope, as if she were more than just the new kid, a symbol of change, an opportunity to disrupt the stagnant status quo. When she entered the dining room with a tray in her hands, the search engine inside her immediately spotted Blake at his usual center table. But today, something was different. Several of the seats that were usually occupied by his closest minions were empty. Blake himself sat more tensely, his usual relaxed posture gone, replaced by an almost military directness, as if he were preparing for battle. As soon as he noticed her, he called out loudly, "Hey, Walker, don't think you're special just because your dad is a celebrity." His voice echoed throughout the cafeteria, causing every student to freeze. Forks stopped halfway to their mouths, conversation stopped, and all eyes turned first to Blake, then to Emily, waiting for the developments as if they were at a theater performance and not in the school cafeteria. Emily turned slowly to face Blake, who was sitting at his usual table, surrounded by friends who didn't look as confident as their leader. His face was tense, challenging, but his eyes gave him away. There was fear, uncertainty, the knowledge that he was treading unfamiliar territory. "You know what's interesting, Blake?" she asked quietly, her voice quiet but clear in the quiet of the dining room. "It's how desperate you are to prove that you're not afraid." A murmur swept through the dining room like a wave, starting from the nearest tables and spreading to the farthest corners. Blake's face darkened, the color rising to his cheeks, making him look like a volcano about to explode. "Me? Afraid?" He laughed, but it sounded forced, wooden, unnatural. "You know nothing about me, Walker. Absolutely nothing." Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him like a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. "I know enough," she said quietly but confidently. "I know that the only way you can feel important is by putting others down. I know there's insecurity underneath that bravado. And I know you're terrified of others seeing it too." Her words hit home like a skilled archer's arrows. Blake rose slowly to his feet, his body tense like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. The dining room became so quiet that you could hear the dripping of a faulty faucet somewhere. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice shook with barely contained rage. "I swear you'll regret it." It was not an empty threat. In his eyes, Emily saw determination, fury, promise. The promise of war. Emily merely shrugged, feigning indifference, though inside she was completely focused, analyzing every nuance of his behavior, every tone of his voice. She walked toward an empty table in the far corner of the dining room, feeling his gaze on her back like a physical weight. But inside she was wary. There was something in Blake's voice that told her he wasn't just making a threat. He was planning something bigger, and she had to be ready. The dinner was strangely charged. Emily ate alone, but she didn't feel isolated. Instead, she felt an invisible field of energy forming around her, drawing glances, eliciting whispers. She wasn't just new, she was a challenge to the established order. Several times, students she didn't know approached her desk, introducing themselves, expressing admiration for the way she handled Blake, offering friendship, support, or simply information about the school. Emily was polite to everyone, but distant, knowing that many of them were motivated less by affection for her than by curiosity or a desire to be closer to the daughter of a celebrity. After class, she found her locker completely trashed. The door was open, books were spilled on the floor, some pages were torn out, and on the inside of the door, in black marker, was written, "Daddy's Girl." It was petty, predictable, and totally Blake-esque. A group of students gathered around, watching her reaction. Some looked shocked, others sympathetic, others simply curious. Emily calmly gathered her things, showing no sign of frustration or anger. Her hands did not shake, her expression did not waver. She was the picture of calm in the midst of chaos. Nearby stood Jason Park, the quiet Asian guy from the computer club she had noticed in math class. He came over to help her gather her books, his movements cautious, as if he were afraid of scaring a wild animal. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Yes," Emily replied calmly, gratefully accepting the biology textbook he held out to her. "It's just a locker, and not the most creative vandalism I've seen." Jason nodded, his eyes understanding in a way that surprised Emily. Most people would have expressed shock, outrage, or awkward sympathy, but Jason seemed to really understand. "They do it every time," he said, almost as a statement rather than a question. "When a new guy doesn't fit into their system." Emily looked at him carefully, seeing in him not just a casual well-wisher, but a potential ally. Jason was thin, with tousled black hair and large wire-rimmed glasses. At first glance, he was a typical school nerd, but in his eyes, Emily saw insight and intelligence that immediately made her reconsider her first impression. "You're the president of the computer club, right?" she asked, remembering how he'd introduced himself in class. Jason nodded, slightly surprised that she remembered. "Yeah, that's me." He hesitated, looking around as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered his voice. "Listen, there's something you should know. Blake's been sending messages to his friends. About you. Pretty nasty stuff." Emily looked at him carefully. "Thank you for telling me." "Not just you," Jason continued, his voice barely audible. "All of us. Those he considers beneath him, which is pretty much everyone." Emily nodded, not surprised by this information. Blake was a classic school bully, and this behavior was typical of his type. "I'm the president of the computer club," Jason repeated, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. "And," he paused, looking around again, "if you ever need any help with digital stuff, let me know. Blake has been bullying me and a lot of others for years, and he's not as smart as he thinks he is when it comes to technology." Emily looked at him with new interest. Jason wasn't just offering help with her computer science homework. He was offering access to something bigger, information that could change the balance of power. "I'll remember that, Jason," she said sincerely, smiling truly for the first time all day. "Thank you." When she left the school, Vin was already waiting for her in his Challenger, parked some distance away from the main parking lot so as not to cause unnecessary excitement. "How was your day?" he asked as she sat down next to him, fastening her seatbelt. "Interesting," Emily said, leaning back in her seat and exhaling, as if releasing the tension of the day. "Blake's out for revenge. He trashed my locker, and apparently he's spreading rumors about me." Vin frowned, his face becoming serious. "Do you want me to talk to the director?" Emily immediately shook her head. "No, Dad, I'll handle it myself." "Are you sure?" There was concern in his voice, but also respect for her decision. He never forced his protection on her, always gave her the opportunity to decide for herself when she needed his intervention and when she preferred to cope on her own. "Absolutely," she turned to him, a glint in her eye that Vin knew well. A glint that said she wasn't just reacting to a situation, she was planning. "I learned something interesting. Blake seems to have a history of bullying students, and some of them wouldn't mind seeing him get what he deserves." Vin looked at his daughter, a mixture of pride and worry in his eyes. Pride in her intelligence, her strength, her determination. Worry about where this conflict might escalate. "Just be careful," he said seriously. "Don't cross the line." "I'll just give him enough rope to hang himself," Emily replied, and her voice held the confidence of someone who sees the big picture. "All I have to do is wait and watch." Vin nodded, starting the engine. He knew that expression, knew that strategy. It was a strategy he often used himself, both in his movies and in real life. Not attack the enemy head on, but allow him to make a mistake, and then use that mistake against him. You really are my daughter, he said with a smile as he pulled out of the school parking lot. That evening, while Emily was doing her homework in her room, her phone vibrated, alerting her to a new message. It was an unfamiliar number. She opened the message with some caution, but immediately relaxed when she saw the sender's name. Hey, it's Jason from school. Sorry to post so late, but I may have found something you should see. Blake isn't as smart as he thinks. He forgot to log out of his school library account, and I saved some interesting screenshots. Not just of you, of all of us. If you want to see them, let me know. Emily read the message twice, feeling a plan forming in her head. Not a plan of attack, but a plan of justice. Blake Carter, like so many others like him, lived a double life, public and private. And the line between those lives was apparently thinner than he thought. Thank you, Jason, she replied. I'd like to see it. Can we meet tomorrow before school starts? The answer came almost immediately. Sure. Computer lab, 7:30. No one will be there. Emily smiled at the screen. A plan was beginning to form in her mind. Clear, precise, effective. Blake used fear and humiliation as weapons against others. Perhaps it was time for him to feel the power of his own weapons. The next morning, she arrived at school earlier than usual and met Jason in the empty computer room. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the tall windows. The computers weren't turned on yet, and the room had that special quiet that only empty schoolrooms have in the early morning. Jason was already waiting for her, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. He was wearing the same science joke t-shirt he had on yesterday and looked like he had barely slept. Thank you for coming, he said, ushering her into the office and quietly closing the door. I wasn't sure you'd take it seriously. Emily nodded. I always take information seriously, she said simply, especially information that could change the rules of the game. Jason smiled weakly, then walked over to one of the computers and turned it on. While the machine was booting, he pulled a flash drive out of his pocket and plugged it into the USB port. What I'm about to show you may seem like an invasion of privacy, he said quietly, and technically it is. But Blake, he deserves it, after everything he's done to the others. Emily nodded, neither judging nor encouraging. She simply waited, watching as Jason opened the folder on the flash drive full of screenshots. What he showed her was beyond her wildest expectations. Hundreds of messages Blake had sent to his friends across multiple platforms. Text messages, social media, private chats. Messages in which he not only bullied other students, calling them horrible names, making fun of their appearance, their background, their economic status, but also betrayed even those he called friends. Messages to Jason Richards about Tyler Kent being dumb as a rock but useful for intimidation. Messages to Sarah Mills about Amber Johnson, acting like a queen but really just a mean girl. Messages that were racist, sexist, homophobic, classist. Messages that showed the true face of Blake Carter, the face of a man who used others as pawns in his power game. And of course, there were messages about her appearance, about her father, about what he would do to put her in her place. Messages that ranged from the merely offensive to the downright threatening. Jason had collected a collection of digital evidence of years of bullying and manipulation. It was a dossier on the school bully, compiled by one of his many victims. How did you get access to all this? Emily asked, her eyes glued to the screen where Blake's messages were appearing one after another, each worse than the last. Jason shifted from foot to foot, clearly nervous. Blake's not as smart as he thinks he is, he said quietly. Yesterday in the library, he forgot to log out of his accounts on the school computer. I didn't plan on it. I just saw that he wasn't logged out, and at first I was just going to close everything. But then I noticed the messages about me. His voice wavered. About how he'd humiliated me in front of his friends all these years. And then I saw that there were others in there, including you. Emily nodded thoughtfully. What Jason had done was technically illegal, hacking personal accounts. But what Blake had done was morally repugnant, terrorizing students for years, manipulating, humiliating, threatening. I could print it out, Jason offered, but what do you want to do with it? Emily thought for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the screenshots, analyzing, planning. She didn't just want revenge on Blake. She wanted justice. She wanted him to feel the same sense of helplessness his victims had felt. She wanted him to understand that every choice had consequences. Print out the most egregious ones, she said finally. The ones where he talks about his own friends. The ones who are always around him, who think he's on their side. and bring them to me before class." Jason nodded, his eyes a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure?" Blake isn't the type to forgive easily. Emily smiled, but there was no warmth in her smile. "I know, that's why it has to happen. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show him his true reflection in the mirror." When the first bell rang, the hallways quickly filled with students, noisy and energetic as they always were before the start of the school day. Blake stood by his locker, surrounded by his entourage as usual, his posture radiating his usual self-assurance. Though Emily noticed a new tension in his shoulders, a new caution in his eyes. But today something was different. People were looking at him, whispering, and quickly looking away when he noticed them looking. There was a strange tension in the hallway, a sense of impending conflict that everyone felt, but no one could explain. Jason appeared at the end of the hallway, holding a folder. He nodded to Emily and she felt her heart speed up. The moment of truth was approaching. Blake opened his locker and froze. Inside, plastered all over the surface, were dozens of screenshots. His own words turned against him. Page after page of his true thoughts, his real face behind the charming leader. Emily watched from across the hallway, her face calm but her insides seething with emotion. She watched as one by one, Blake's friends came closer, peering over his shoulder, their faces going through stages of confusion, shock, and finally anger as they read what Blake really thought of them. "Tyler is such an idiot, I'm surprised he even finds his way to school." "Amber thinks she's special because her dad is rich. In reality, she's just another spoiled bully." "Jason? He's useful when it comes to copying homework. Otherwise, he's a total loser." Message after message, insult after insult. Everything Blake had ever said about his so-called friends was there in front of them now, laid out in all its ugly truth. Blake's face went white as a sheet, as if all the blood had drained from it. He began frantically tearing up the papers, his movements jerky and panicked. "What the heck is this?" His voice shook with rage and fear, echoing down the silent hallway. But it was too late. Dozens of students had already taken pictures of the printouts on their phones, and the news was spreading like wildfire through the school. Within minutes, every student at Mountain Creek would know that Blake Carter, the self-proclaimed king of the school, had betrayed everyone, including those he called his closest friends. He looked up to see Emily standing nearby, just watching, her face impassive but her eyes piercing. Their eyes met across the hallway, and in that moment he knew. "You!" he hissed, turning away from the locker and taking a few steps toward her. His face was contorted with anger, the veins in his neck bulging, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. "You did it!" Emily didn't back down. She stood still, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert, assessing his every move. "No, Blake," she said quietly, her voice quiet but clear in the quiet of the hallway. "I didn't do this. You did it. Every text, every insult, every betrayal, it was you. I just helped others see the real you." One by one, his friends began to walk away from him. Some looked at him with open disgust, others with pain from betrayal. Tyler, his most loyal follower, simply shook his head and walked away without a word. Amber, the girl who always looked at him with adoration, now looked at him with tears in her eyes, her face red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Blake's social empire, built over years, was crumbling before his eyes. Every connection, every alliance, every friendship evaporating like morning fog under the rays of the merciless sun of truth. "You'll regret this," he growled, taking another step toward Emily, his right hand twitching as if he was on the verge of hitting her. "I'll make you pay." "Blake Carter!" Principal Monroe's voice rang out through the crowd of students that had now filled the hallway, drawn by the noise and the sense of conflict. The principal was a tall man with graying hair and a stern gaze that was now aimed directly at Blake. "To my office. Now." Blake froze, aware that all eyes were on him. His familiar world of control and power was crumbling, leaving him defenseless before the court of public opinion he had ignored for so long. His face twisted in a final flash of anger and despair, and he looked at Emily with such hatred that for a moment she felt a chill of fear. But then, without a word, he turned and followed the principal, his shoulders slumped, his head down, every step betraying defeat. The hallway exploded with conversation as Blake disappeared around the corner. Students gathered in groups discussing what they had seen, showing each other pictures of the messages they had made. Years of suppressed resentment and fear of Blake spilled out into open conversations. Stories of what he had done, how he had humiliated them, how he had made them afraid. Jason walked up to Emily, his eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. That was impressive, he said quietly. I didn't think it would be like this. Thank you for your help, Emily said, her voice soft and sincere. But all we did was show the truth. Blake created this result himself, with his actions, with his words. We simply took off the mask. Jason nodded, something akin to awe in his gaze. You think it'll make a difference? In the long run, I mean. Emily looked down the hallway at the groups of students who were now talking freely, laughing, some even hugging, as if a huge weight had been lifted from their shoulders. I think it's made a difference, she said. Not everything, and not forever, but enough that everyone can breathe easier. By the end of the day, news of Blake's revelation had spread throughout the school. The reactions were mixed. Most students openly condemned Blake, especially those who had suffered his own bullying, but some of his most loyal friends still tried to justify him, saying that the messages had been taken out of context or even doctored. The teachers and school administration responded quickly but with restraint. Principal Monroe called Blake in for a serious talk, which was attended by the school psychologist and Blake's parents. After reviewing the evidence and testimony from other students, it was decided to suspend him for 3 days and schedule mandatory sessions with a psychologist who specializes in adolescent bullying. His status at school was seriously shaken, but not completely destroyed. He had spent too much time building up his social network. Some students still saw him as a leader, although there was now doubt in their eyes. The football coach also had a serious talk with him about team spirit and respect for his comrades. When Emily walked out to the parking lot after school ended, she was surrounded not by the loneliness and isolation she had expected as the new girl, but by a wave of gratitude and respect. Students she barely knew came up to thank her, to tell her that she had inspired them, that they finally felt safe in their own school. Vin was already waiting for her, leaning against his challenger, watching the proceedings with a look of both pride and concern, like any father watching his child grapple with the challenges of the adult world. How was your day? He asked with a slight smile as she approached the car, waving away another group of excited students. Justice has been served, Emily replied, getting into the car and closing the door, cutting herself off from the chaos of the schoolyard. In the quiet of the car, she finally allowed herself to exhale, releasing the tension that had been holding her all day. Vin studied her face for a moment, his eyes attentive, understanding. Are you okay? He asked quietly, knowing his daughter well enough to see the turmoil of emotion behind her calm facade. Emily considered this. Blake had gotten what he deserved. The school had been freed from his tyranny. The students who had suffered in silence for years had finally found a voice. But she felt no triumph or gloating, only a quiet satisfaction that balance had been restored, that justice, albeit in her small school world, had been done. Yes, she said finally, and it was true. I'm fine. I'm proud of you, Vin said, starting the engine. You didn't stoop to his level. You just let the truth do its job. Emily smiled, looking ahead at the road that stretched into the distance. I told you, sometimes it's best to just wait. My daughter, the strategist, Vin chuckled as he pulled out of the school parking lot. You always know when to strike. As they drove away, Emily spotted Blake standing at the entrance to the school. He wasn't entirely alone. A couple of his friends were keeping their distance, but they weren't daring to come close. His shoulders were tense, and there was a mix of anger and confusion in his posture. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw a complex cocktail of emotions in his eyes. Anger, confusion, humiliation, and maybe a tiny spark of recognition. The understanding that his actions had consequences, that the walls of his social fortress weren't as impenetrable as he thought. Emily felt no satisfaction in his fall, only sadness for the lost opportunities, for what Blake could have been if he had chosen kindness over cruelty, respect over fear. She turned away looking at the road ahead. The dramas of school seemed so small compared to the wide horizon that lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free, not from Blake or his bullying, but from the burden she carried with her from school to school, the fear of being seen, the need to hide. With her father by her side, the wind blowing through the open windows of the Challenger, and the sun setting over San Diego, painting the sky purple and gold, she finally felt like she had found her place, a place where she could be herself. Not a victim, not an avenger, just Emily Walker, Vin Diesel's daughter, a girl who knew her worth and didn't need anyone else's validation to make her feel strong. Vin glanced at her quickly, noticing the peace on her face. What are you thinking about? Emily smiled, a real, open smile he'd rarely seen in years. About the future, she said, and about how maybe this time we won't have to move next month. Vin sighed, a mixture of guilt and determination etched on his face. You know, we're moving for more than just school, he said softly. With my job and film schedule, and for your safety. Being the daughter of a celebrity isn't always easy. I know, Dad, Emily said, touching his arm. But maybe we can stay here a little longer? I think I'm finally starting to find my place. Vin smiled, the sound of his quiet laughter mixing with the rumble of the engine. Maybe, he agreed. Besides, the next movie is filming not far from here. But I hear Chicago has some great schools, too. Emily rolled her eyes, but the smile remained on her face. Let's see how things go here first, okay? Vin nodded, and there was such love in his eyes, such pride, that Emily felt a lump in her throat. Whatever you say, baby. Whatever you say. The car sped up, carrying them further and further away from school, from the past, towards a future that for the first time in a long time seemed not like a frightening unknown, but a promise of something better, something real. And in that moment, watching school disappear in the rearview mirror, Emily realized something important. She was no longer afraid of being seen. She was no longer afraid of being herself, because her uniqueness, her strength, her ability to see people for who they were was not a curse, but a gift. A gift that she was just beginning to learn to use.